Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Production channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another album of the week. This is episode number 175, and today's episode is an anniversary spotlight on Under the Blade, the debut full-length album for, of course, Twisted Sister. And I'm just finally glad that I'm able to finally discuss one of my absolute favorite records, especially from Twisted Sister, but just one of my favorite metal records from this period. I mean, I've already discussed, Screaming for Vengeance. I've already discussed Blackout and even Wiped Out this year again, from Raven, Scorpions, and Judas Priest, so on. I haven't even touched on Iron Fist, because that was an even older episode, so I was never really able to do a anniversary spotlight on Iron Fist, but that's definitely up there, one of my favorite records from this time period of 1982. I've yet to even get to some of my other ones, like Restless and Wild and such and such, I've yet to get to those. But Under the Blade is definitely obviously up there. This to me is like top tier classic metal from 1982. So I'm not going to get into a whole history lesson, whatever. I'm not going to really go into a lot of that or any sort of in-depth history, whatever, about Twisted Sister. I think everyone right now who has probably subscribed to me, who obviously have been fans of Twisted Sister, probably have all read biography books and interviews and anything that surrounds the early history of Twisted Sister that goes basically up to Under the Blade and everything. Everyone has heard that. Everyone's probably even listened to Dee Snider talk about the early history of Twisted Sister. Everyone's probably heard J.J. French talk about at least the early times of Twisted Sister. So I'm not going to go into every bit of detailing about the early history, but I'm going to only talk about certain bullet point stuff. So that's about that. So let me just get into that anyways. Basically, as far as when it comes to the recording history of Twisted Sister, it pretty much goes all the way back to 1979 with, of course, the very first demo, which I think pretty much served as the basis for the 1999 compilation disc, which was the Club Days Volume 1, the studio sessions, and the lineup for that band, which of course bleeds into the very first 7-inch, which would be titled I'll Never Grow Up Now, which I don't own that 7-inch, but I have that song as part of the Still Crazy compilation from 1981, which had some great bands on there, but it's got the original version, probably the first, and I'll get to mixing stuff, later on into my overall discussion of Under the Blade. But it all bleeds into, again, the lineup from the demo period bleeds into the very first 7-inch, I'll Never Grow Up Now, which the lineup for this right here, which I'm going to go through, again, Dee Snider on vocals, J.J. French on guitar, and of course Eddie Jada as well on guitar, and of course backing vocals. Mark the Animal Mendoza, which I should also kind of bring up this little fact that before Twisted Sister, he was also in the band, the Dictators, which of course is best known for having Ross the Boss, who would also, again, after the split of the Dictators, I believe the split. I think they did split up at one point, and that's where ended up being the formation for Manowar. But Mark Mendoza, of course, was the bass player for the Dictators at one point. But here he is with Twisted Sister, which is where he basically made his name more known with this band. Of course, on drums is Tony Petrie, who obviously wouldn't go anywhere further past possibly at least 1980. Because we'll get into again, the main drummer that everybody at least recognizes, with Twisted Sister. But this is as far as it got for Tony Petrie. He does end up on what would become, basis for the Rough Cuts EP, which I'll get into in a bit here. But the Bad Boys of Rock and Roll 7-inch ended up being the pretty much the last thing with Tony Petrie on drums. Again, it featured, of course, again, released, June 4th, 1980. It features an original version of Bad Boys of Rock and Roll, but also a song called Ladies Boy, which didn't get, it didn't make it onto any other album, but it has made it onto again, that Club Days Volume 1 disc from 1999, that being the studio sessions. That's as far as it's ever gotten past, the vinyl or the early demo stage, whatever. But that's about it. Then, of course, into 1981, there would be a little bit of a difference in lineup. And this is where I'm going to go into the Rough Cuts EP, because the lineup for this period in at least 81 to 82-ish, at least, was I would say probably 81. I'm just going to go with 81. Tony Petrie, I think, he would be out of the band, and he would end up getting replaced by, his name was Fast Joey Brighton, and this is as far as he had gone, at least for the Rough Cuts EP. And again, it had at least the 2 songs he were on, which were the first 2 songs on the EP. That being an early version of What You Don't Know, parentheses, Sure Can Hurt You, and of course Shoot 'Em Down. Those were the only 2 he ever recorded with Twisted Sister, and he'd be out of the band, of course. Rest in peace to Fast Joey Brighton, who passed away on April 14th of 2010. So there you go. That's about it with when it comes to any light with at least previous drummers, because finally, by the time when it came to obviously the period of writing or even coming up with the recording stuff for Under the Blade, that being, of course, the late A.J. Pero. So that pretty much being the classic lineup of Twisted Sister. So yeah, basically J.J. French, Eddie Ajita, Dee Snider, Mark Mendoza, and A.J. Pero being the classic lineup. So I think most of the recording sessions for this album was, I think, taking place during the time that they were billed or at least performing at the Reading Festival in 1981. So I'm going to take it there, because of, if you've got the deluxe or 2-disc copy that Armory Records had released in 2011 for Under the Blade, it features the second disc was, of course, is an really good remastered footage of the Reading Festival show that they played on their performance, and of course during, I think, was it the Rolling Stones cover track, which would be the last song that they end off. They obviously there'll be a lot of guests coming on stage, that being Lemmy, Fast Eddie Clark, who at the point had just left Motorhead, and Pete Way of UFO. So, and of course that pretty much leads into the overall recording sessions for Under the Blade, because Pete Way was actually set to produce the album, and I think he was there with the band. However, I don't think he even knew a thing about producing yet. As far as I know, I don't know if he really had much in producing, but he gets credit as a producer on the album, but I don't think he did much in producing, other than maybe kind of guiding the band. He probably might have been a guidance to the band in a way, as far as when it came to how these songs were supposed to be performed for an album, but I'm not sure he really knew a lick about producing or mixing maybe as much. But I think, again, it's the early stages. But still, he gets listed. Now, for the recording sessions for this album, of course, took place from July to August of 1982, and it was all at least 2 places this was being recorded at least. The Barn at Kitchenham Farm in Ashburnham with the Rack Mobile. Then, of course, IC Studios in Eastbourne. Meissen, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Rogue in London, England. So there it is. Who knows? This might have all been in one, city, whatever, in the UK. But it all took place at a barn, basically. The recording, everything took place at this barn, and they had, of course, the rack mobile and everything. So it was very primitive, in a way. It was primitive, and if you've ever listened to, of course, the little dot or letter interviews, whatever, that are like bonus features, whatever, on the DVD portion for Under the Blade, for a part of the Armory Records 2011 reissue. It's funny. It's funny. There's like one, I gotta bring it up. It's just too goddamn hilarious, and it definitely left an impression on Dee Snider, where he's talking about how friggin' Mark Mendoza would be playing a bass, and all of a sudden the cows would just start shitting. Literally, right on spot, they just start shitting while Mark Mendoza would just be playing his bass, because he probably has the bass, the volume on it turned up loud, and it's enough to where it's almost TMI to an extent, but it's just hilarious. But it definitely left an impression. But the whole thing left an impression on them. It was a wild experience for them, but also a bit of at times not too fun of experience, but not nearly as much of a bad experience. But it definitely was something brand new to them for this experience, especially just the idea that they're recording their very first record, especially for JJ Friends, who definitely was like, and their opinions on Under the Blade would definitely come out at some point afterwards. And again, they're not shy about it. It's not that they're gonna, like they've ever said, that they really dislike the songs on the record. It's just that it comes mostly in the mastering department for the album, in a way, and maybe the mixing, a little bit of the production, but so on. Again, it's low budget. They weren't making big money yet. They weren't a highly successful band yet. It's just that they were very successful as a live act, but as far as when it comes to record sales, not nearly as much. So they definitely were still very much in just early days, just very, very, very early for them. So that's, again, just the youngin' years for Twisted Sister still. But again, it still was a bit of a interesting time frame for them. So eventually, and of course I know Pete Way does get, again, Pete Way during this period, especially this album, he definitely is listed as producer. But again, from what I've heard, and especially it's been coming out, that Mark Mendoza did the most of the producing and the mastering, and at times a little bit of the mixing. But from the little interviews that I watched on the DVD portion for the 2-disc copy from 2011, obviously there was somebody else involved that had more of a hand in mixing the album. And that's where, and there's a list. There's a whole bunch, 3 guys that are usually listed as either the engineer, the masterer, and even the mixer. And these names being Will Gosling, Craig Thompson, and Dave Boscombe. I hope I pronounced that all correctly, but they are listed as both the engineers and the mixers for the album. And within those 3 names are probably the ones that are mostly responsible for why the record turned out the way that it did. Also, during the recording sessions for this album, at least the recording of the album, I always get stuck saying sessions. But again, since he appeared also on stage with them at the Reading Festival for their Rolling Stones cover track, was of course Fast Eddie Clarke of Motorhead, who came in to do guest soloing, at least for the song Tear It Loose, alongside, JJ French. So, and it's just really, I think both, because of one of those two, I think actually is the one that does, dueling guitar soloing alongside Fast Eddie Clarke on the song Tear It Loose. But again, he's pretty much the only sort of guest musician you'll ever hear on this record. And again, since obviously, to give credit for, since they moved to the UK basically to record this record, because of this, somehow it was able to give them at least street credit in a way, with at least the new wave of British heavy metal crowd. And obviously because of Fast Eddie Clarke and Pete Way, obviously just their names on this record was probably enough to do it. So eventually, pretty much, and getting signed with Secret Records for this record here, and of course them also during this period, they also had released that Rough Cuts EP on September 18th of 1982. This album finally ends up seeing the light of day, and this became a huge hit with the new wave of British heavy metal crowd, to an extent to where they were pretty much in a way, unofficially were accepted as a part of the new wave of British heavy metal movement. Even though, again, they were from New York. These were basically, it's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde aspect with, or a Jekyll and Hyde effect, actually, I think is a better word to use for Twisted Sister, is that they would dress like glam guys, whatever, on stage. But when it comes to like recording and being on the street, especially when it comes to like what the back cover for Under the Blade, they would be in their street clothing. So they always kind of somewhat had a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde effect with their whole persona. And I think that's one of the things I think that really kind of what really appealed in a way, because it's like for stage they'll dress like this, but when they're on the streets, and they're going to look like just basically really fit in with the new wave of British heavy metal crowd, like the Ravens and the Tigers of Pantanes to an extent. What else? I'm already kind of drawing a blank. Like, let's say Saxon or Samson, whatever these guys, just the Demon Leather crowd. That's what worked, and that's what got them. And musically, it worked. Even the production and the mixing of this record even worked, because of most of the records that were coming out, unless you're going to count certain records that really were very highly produced, like let's say some of the full-length records, but when it came to like the 7-inch bands, this was perfect with that crowd, and especially the ones on like Neat Records, this was perfect for them. To the band, it wasn't. But to that crowd, it was. Because to them, they lived with the stuff that was on Heavy Metal Records and Neat Records and Guardians and Tapes and everything, that where a lot of those 7 inches and some of those records were very raw sounding. The recording quality was very DIY, and it just was perfect. It had a live feel. And that's what you kind of get pretty much with the record here. Because of the mixing, the production on the original mix for, again, I'm using the term original mix there because I'm alluding to it. It gave these songs a very lively feel, like they almost were being recorded live instead of just sound like studio tracks. And I mean, when you hear the opening stuff to like What You Don't Know, parentheses, Sure Can Hurt You, you know exactly that this is going to be a raucous record. And from right then and there to Bad Boys of Rock and Roll to Run For Your Life and everything, just to pretty much the very last song on here, Day of the Rocker. This is a no BS, no frills, no ballad, just raucous heavy metal record that really belonged as part of this movement, even though they were again, they were an American band. They're from the United States. They're from New York. But musically, this fit along with the British metal bands. It just had that aesthetic. I know these days when now, because of Twisted Sister being somehow lumped into the whole glam and hair metal movement with like Motley Crue and Cinderella and Rat and whoever, and just those bands in general, they look at the sound and they're going to look at the perspective of like Too Fast for Love, and they say, yeah, it's like a heavier version of Too Fast for Love. To a extent, yes. However, I think that's almost the wrong aspect. I would the wrong eyes I would actually, or the wrong pair of ears I would have, when looking and listening to this record, because of it's too different sounding to me than like Too Fast for Love. So I think that everyone again, it's just typical bullshit journalism for people who just have to lump in because of it's what we have to do, because of we've got to keep shit up. But to me, this was more in line with what was coming out of Britain during this period than anything that was coming out of the United States. It was very much New York. It had more of I would say that anything that would be more comparable to anyone from the United States would be like Riot and the Rods, who are very much were from the New York tri-state area and everything, but it's that very almost street aesthetic that, to an extent, yes, Motley Crue had in their early period, but by the time after Shout the Devil, they started getting more success. That street aesthetic just got tossed out the window, and they went for what the money's, which money smelled better, even though they all probably all smelled the same, but they just like, I guess, which money had more coke on it, whatever. So, but to this, there's just at least had more street aesthetic, especially within the streets of the UK, and it just worked. I mean, to me, I've lived to this record for pretty much, at this point, we're going on to what, 13, 11, 14 years possibly at this point I've lived with listening to this record. And it's obviously just one of my personal favorites. And there's, to me, I just love the mixing and the production of the original mix. I'm going to get to the remix soon. I'm going to get to it. But there's just such a raw attitude to this album. It just sounds so feral. Like these guys just sound like they are not trying to appeal to anyone other than the metal crowd. You can tell they're what audience they're really appealing to, and it's they sound young and hungry on this record. From just from the opening song to even like "Run for Your Life," "Sin After Sin," "Destroyer," which is obviously the slowest song on the album, but it's a heavy number, and to where I almost get more Anvil vibes, because I mean this was released the same year as Metal on Metal. Again, one of my other personal favorite albums from this period, and it just fits alongside that. It's just what an awesome song. Actually, I do need to, since I'm on the topic of the song "Destroyer," I kind of bring this one out because of when I started really kind of getting into crime stories or murder stories during this period, and especially in the early 80s, I got into just reading stories or listening to stories on YouTube about what is, or at least what this person was named as, or got referred to as the original Night Stalker, who eventually, many years later, in the past few or 3 years, whatever, ended up getting caught. But he got dubbed the original Night Stalker, and he would record these. And again, they all got recorded. The phone calls he'd give out before, possibly, while stalking them and then going them and actually committing murder. But he would leave, and apparently they all got left as messages, and they all found these recordings. And again, he'd make little noises, it's in breathing sounds in here, but because of the very, very low aspect recording quality of phone recordings during those periods, because it was all recorded on the tape, but it's so low quality that it just sounds almost like a freaking robot or something, almost like Darth Vader to an extent. It's and I kind of wonder where Twisted Sister got the sound effects for the opening stuff of Destroyer, because they sound so identical. And I'm wondering, did they learn about these recordings to an extent? Or who used these recording aspects? Could have been the band fucking around on the phone, whatever, because that's what it sounds like. It sounds like recorded phone call quality for these sound effects for the beginning, and it sounds like breathing. And I'm wondering, did they get this stuff from possibly the original Night Stalker recording? How they could have gone out. I'm not saying that they got these recordings, but this sounds almost so identical. And so if you ever look up this stuff on YouTube, especially the phone recordings for the original Night Stalker, and if you listen to the little effects, whatever, at the beginning of Destroyer, they sound almost identical. So I don't know where they would have gotten this stuff from, but that's, again, new pair of ears after whatever, going that little rabbit hole there and just listening to that kind of stuff. And it's just, now I listen to the beginning stuff for Destroyer, just now I think of that instead of just the first time I probably had heard this and be like, wow, this is kind of cool. But no, now it's just, I think of the recording stuff for the original Night Stalker and the stuff he'd leave on his victim's recording machine. It's crazy. About that in there. Of course, the title track's freaking awesome, and of course, Tear It Loose. These are all just straight up bar burners, and I just love them all. Just great freaking songs, and you don't honestly, I don't think you need to really hear me go in any depth about these songs. Whatever, you all know them, you love them, and I think I'm just gonna keep it there. Also, do bring up the fact that Under the Blade, of course, by the time of 85, which I guess I should now get into that. I guess it's about time I should get into this part, which would be the remixed version of Under the Blade, which is kind of the first version I actually heard for Under the Blade. Of course, I did hear some versions that were the original mix for like Run For Your Life and Sin After Sin. These, I think, are the versions I heard first. For at least are the original mixes of for at least the album. But really the majority of the album I heard was the remixed version from 1985 that came out on Atlantic. Now, the reasons for why the album got remixed, of course, one, it was an excuse, besides the fact that Secret Records was, they went out of business. They went out of business, and that means this album completely went out of print. I mean, it was already going out of print anyways, but it had been, released plenty of times, even through, like, the early stages of Roadrunner Records, and it was just hard to find at least a copy in the States, in a way, and the band, of course, were never happy with the original mixing. They always the D. Snyder said that the guy that was mixing the album, he made the comment is that the guy apparently hated loud music, and he'd have his ears plugged up. You know, he put the little mufflers, whatever, in his ear, and apparently that's why the album sounded the way that it did, because of it's just like, I don't like loud music and everything, and that's why it just didn't sound great, because of, again, every producer or mixer for any other record obviously didn't have no problem listening to anything loud, and that's how they were able to really better mix a record, because of they're listening at the best sonics as possible, and this guy just didn't. And that's apparently where a lot of the blame comes down to, is that, well, we had a guy that hated loud music, and that's why it came out sounding like shit. And so that's all in the words of D. Snyder too, pretty much. And so they just wanted a reason to remix the album, and two, they wanted it back in print. And so that's where it came to in 1985 to have Atlantic to release this brand new version of Under the Blade with different artwork, because right now you're probably seeing the new artwork for the album, which is basically from the same photo sessions that was the original artwork that you found, like their original secret pressings, whatever, of Under the Blade. But really, it's just different, more brighter. The red is more vibrant on this version of the album cover. And it's just all a bit more different, but this all got used. Another big difference to this album is the inclusion of a remixed version of I'll Never Grow Up Now, which was never recorded during the sessions for the album. It wasn't. Again, this is basically a remixed version of the track that was on their very first 7-inch, their very first release, that being, again, from 1979. So therefore, it's Tony Petrie on drums and not AJ Pero on drums. It would have been nice if they found a way to record a version of I'll Never Grow Up Now with AJ Pero. At the same time, it probably wouldn't have had the same recording qualities as the songs on the album. Because again, they were very raw, recorded to an extent. They were low budget. But that's what they did. They remixed the entire record, and during this period when it got remixed, this also was the subject of controversy, especially within the PMRC and the 5015, whatever it was dubbed as, and it was the song Under the Blade that was a part of this Filthy 15, alongside Let Me Put My Love Into You by AC/DC and Into the Coven for Merciful Fate as well being on there. Even Trashed from Black Sabbath was on this list. But this song was put on there. And the reason, and this was a subject, of course, for the court hearings, because of, again, or whatever, obviously it took in a room, whatever, and D. Side, of course, went, of course, to there to basically stand up for the band. He was the one, and that's where, again, he all went into about how he wrote this whole entire piece of his overall speech. He wrote his entire speech for this occasion, and again, he went through it. If you don't need me to recite everything he said, you don't need me. It's already been stated. You can find YouTube clips of Dee Snider talking about how he wrote this whole piece and how he pretty much looked at it as like he was setting out a bomb to basically to the people in this room, to all the politicians. But again, when it came to the discussion for the song Under the Blade, Tippercore basically said that this song obviously was she thought it was sexual and everything. He thought it meant like this was promoting sadomasochism, bondage, and rape. But, however, this is where Dee Snider ended up rebuting every bit of that and said no. This was about surgery. Eddie Ojita's, I think, throat surgery, I think. Or was it heart surgery? I can't remember what surgery he was going through. But it was obviously was inspired by the fact that Eddie Ojita was going in for surgery. And during the period, obviously, of 1982... and that's where he got or at least 82 or 81-ish, whatever, 80, during that period, the early 80s, okay? I know I'm screwing up a little bit of there. I think it was on the Bad Boys, actually, so was it 79 maybe? Was it 79? Actually, it was 79, so I'm completely wrong. So in 1979, Eddie Ojita, obviously that year, was probably going into surgery. I'm just going on guessing, okay, people? I'm going on guessing. But so it was about surgery and the fears of surgery in a way, and since it instills onto someone who obviously is afraid of getting surgery, and that's what the song is, and it's a heavy song, and in a way it works. So the themes for it worked. And of course, they all kind of looked at him and gave the little comment about, really, you're going to write a song about your guitar player's surgery? Just to deflect it because of that, they have to. They just don't want to admit that they were wrong about the themes for the song Under the Blade. Obviously, it's so stupid. Obviously, blading and bondage, I don't think go well together unless you're going to try and murder someone. So I don't get that. It's just, again, sick people. But Dee Snider did point out that the only thing. What was it he said this way? Is like the only sadomasochism, bondage, and rape in this song is in the mind of Mrs. Gore. So there you go. So that's pretty much it. It was all controversy during this period. But so by the time of the wake of the re-release of Under the Blade, it was all during a time of controversy. There you go. I had to get a little bit of that into this video. I had to go into at least the Dee Snider versus the PMRC. So I threw that in this video. It's a very historical part in musical history, and especially within rock and roll and heavy metal in the 1980s, and of course in Twisted Sister's history. So it's a big thing, and obviously it does play into even Under the Blade. In a way to where if I was ever to speak about, let's say, Stained Class from Judas Priest, I have to bring about the suicide trial from that took place in Reno, Nevada, and was it like 1990 or 91-ish or 92 or whatever, around the period of like Painkiller. I have to always go into that. So there's things, there are just historical things that have to get brought up whenever I'm discussing certain records. There we go. So there it is. Again, after this album, obviously it gets them the attention of Atlantic Records, and from there on, history is made there. Of course, for years, because of the fact that this album ended up getting remixed in 1985, a lot of the CD reissues of this album all end up featuring the remix from 1985. The only way you're probably able to find a CD reissue with the original mix would have been the original, was it the Slimline Roadrunner CD stuff, the Slimline series that Roadrunner Records had released in 85 or 84, and that was the only way you actually would have been able to get a hold of the original mix of Under the Blade, because again, Roadrunner still had some rights to the original mix of Under the Blade, because again, it was one of the earliest records that they released in their infancy, where they kind of were partnering up with different labels, especially like Secret Records, for this record. Obviously, because it was notorious as being one of the really heavy records from any sort of glam band, in a way. Even though I don't really consider Twisted Sister a glam band, but in a way they dressed up like glam people in a way. They a little bit did, but not in like a very, sexy kind of way, but more in like a very ugly way. It's like it still had a bit of a very badass kind of aspect to it. So, still, obviously that was the only way you were able to get a hold of the original mix of Under the Blade on CD is those Roadrunner Records Slim 9 CD series stuff. That I like Tokyo Blade and like maybe I think Slayer, Merciful Fate, and Anvil and all those kind of bands was on that series. So there you go. That was the only way you were able to get at least the original mix until 2011, when Armory Records decided to reissue the album as part of, I think it's close to around its anniversary, and for the deluxe copy that would feature a remastered of the reading festival performance of Twisted Sister and all that, remastered for the first time, and again the original mix. So there you go. And now that copy's out of print. But again, I bought it when it was a brand new release in 2011. I got it when it was a brand new release. There it is. So there's, folks. There's my overall thoughts. And again, just obviously celebrating the anniversary of one of the best metal records, and especially one of the best Twisted Sister albums in general. So there it is, Under the Blade. Again, everyone knows it's a really good record to begin with. So if you have any sort of thoughts, whether it be positive or negative, you can leave them in the comment section below. But with that, if you've never really listened to Under the Blade and you're kind of curious about what album to begin with when getting into a band like Twisted Sister, again, I know during a period where it seems like Dee Snider's team seems to say more shit than anything different. And again, he's got his own personality. He's got his own thoughts of stuff. But during this period, and you're kind of and you're on the fence again, you probably one of those where it's like, well, I've only heard one or two songs, that being, we're not gonna take it in, I Wanna Rock, and those are probably to someone that might be generic shit, whatever. But if you're kind of curious on what album to begin with, I would definitely go with this one, and the next word would probably You Can't Stop Rock and Roll, which again, two of my favorite records from this band to begin with. Those are my absolute favorites. Again, Under the Blade and You Can't Stop Rock and Roll are my two favorites. Those would be the ones I would recommend you. So there you go. I hope all of you enjoyed. This is Temporary Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.